Hello, I'm Daniela. In today's video, we're taking a break from slow stitching to make some paper mache birds. These are really two-dimensional birds and they're very whimsical. I make a ton of them, about 15 of them, and I'm going to use them as the centerpiece of a table, so they stand up on bamboo skewers for legs. They're very colorful, very fun, unexpected, and they're the perfect centerpiece for the tables for my father's 77th birthday party. Now, that birthday party takes place in a few weeks, and when it does, I'll post an update with a photo to show you how it looks completed out on the table. But for now, I want to show you the process of creating these beautiful birds. You can create them in any shape. I make my own template, and then after I made the template, I realized I wanted the birds to look different. I didn't want them all to be the same. So out the window the template went. I made small birds and large birds, and because I like variation, I even made a 4-foot tall flamingo. Now the body of the flamingo is only about 1.5 to 2 feet tall, but it certainly adds a little unexpectedness to my flock of birds and a big pop of pink. So let me show you how I make these beautiful birds.
So to make these paper mache birds that are my table decoration, I'm using 2 bamboo skewers as the legs. You can use dowels or you can leave this out altogether. It's up to you. I like to use the bamboo skewers. I use a lot of masking tape, a pair of scissors and a marker, and then I use watered down Mod Podge to attach the paper to my structure. We'll go over that later. For the paper, I like to use scrap paper. These are just some old book pages that I've torn up to use. And I like to use tissue paper. And if I have it, I'll use the little tissue paper that comes in the patterns when you're making clothing. I have an abundance of them, so this makes a great supply to use for this. So to get started, the first thing you want to do is create your bird on your cardboard. Now I made an abundance of birds, so I created a template. But really, you want just a simple shape. I like to make the wings a different layer than the bird itself. So for each completed bird that I make 2 copies on the cardboard. And you can make it any size. It's just dictated by the size cardboard you have. So to make the bird, and you can just play around with it. I start with the beak, the head, the body, and then the tail. And I just play around with it until I get a shape of a bird that I like. I might alter this slightly, but that's it. And then I'll cut that out, use this as my template, and trace another bird. So I'll end up with 2 of these. And then I like to make wings. And for wings, I just make a teardrop shape. And again, I just eyeball it. If it's too small, I can just make it a little bit bigger. And I want to cut out 2 of those as well. I also save a little piece of cardboard, just a scrap, to use in between the legs to give the legs some stability. And I'll show you what I mean. Let me just cut out 2 wings and 2 bodies. So now for each bird that I'm making, I have the 2 bodies, and you can see my drawing is still here, 2 wings, and then the legs and this little spare piece. I like to start with the legs. So I'll set my cardboard aside, and I usually just put them here, just like this. I just like that whimsical look. So I'll take my tape, and I'll start by just taping down the legs, trying to keep them approximately the same height so that the bamboo skewer sticks out approximately the same height. If it doesn't, it's not a problem. I'm going to trim it down later anyway. So I add the tape, and I do a good job burnishing it. Then I take my scrap piece of cardboard, and I just want to use that as a buffer in between the pieces of bamboo skewer. So I trim it down even further so it fits in. I'll add another piece of tape. And then I might also like to add a little bit of cardboard on the top and on the tail, right over here by the head. And I'll add a little piece here by the tail. And this just gives it a buffer. You can be really careful and precise and add more cardboard as you see fit, maybe even a little piece in there. And this just gives you a nice buffer when you finally attach your second bird. It's okay if your masking tape goes over your bird. It doesn't matter in the least. It might make it even easier to secure your cardboard to it. And then I add my second bird just on top. And I like to secure the cardboard with a few pieces of tape. So I'll cut a big piece of tape and then cut it into smaller pieces, keeping my pieces together. They don't have to be exact, but I do try and keep them very similar in size. So once I'm happy that my bird is secure, you can see how that extra cardboard just made it nice and strong and even. I'll decide where I want to place the wings. If I place them up over where the cardboard is, I'll make sure that I really reinforce it with tape on the back. So here's the wing. I'll reinforce it right away. Folding the tape over. And then connecting the tape so that the wing is nice and secure. And I can do this a few times. Go on the other side, cut the tape so that I can fold it over nicely and it's very secure. And then I want to add my last wing. I think I'll add this one right up against the body to show you how easy this one is. I just tape it down. So now that everything is secure, I'm going to go in there with the masking tape and cover every part of the cardboard. So now that I have my bird all taped, kind of like a mummy, I want to really burnish it. I've already burnished it, but I burnish it again and again. I want to make sure this tape is as secure as it's going to get before I start doing the paper mache layer. So once it's burnished, I'll start my paper mache layer. So I took the Mod Podge and I combined it with water. Again, I did 3 parts Mod Podge to 1 part water, and I mixed it up. As you can see, it's still opaque looking, but it's much thinner. I have some torn up paper. I'm saving the tissue paper for last, the next layer. But for this layer, all I'm going to do is take my various papers here. I like to start with the longest parts first, so that's a good size. I brush it right on the paper, and I like to do both sides, very messy. And then I just place it right on my piece, and then I'll smooth it out. I'm really trying to saturate the paper so it's very smooth and easy to work with, and it molds to the shape I want it to be in. I'm trying to avoid wrinkles, but for this project, it's not a problem if there are wrinkles. And I'll just continue this, covering an entire layer of this paper onto this bird. I take my time, can't really rush it. Anytime you're trying to rush it, I spill everything or it doesn't come out well. So I just make sure I have time to do this, and then I need to have time to let it dry, that first layer. Because it's on those legs, I tend to stick it into a candle, an unlit candle, and let it dry overnight or as long as it needs to dry. Since I'm only doing 1 layer or so, there might be the occasional 2 layers on this piece. It usually dries overnight just nicely. And again, just working it down. This silicone mat is great for this because it will just dry in place and I can wipe it off. Or if I'm impatient, I can just wipe it off with a damp cloth while it's still wet. So this is a great tool for me, for all my moods. And I'll just continue adding this layer of paper mache. What I love about paper mache is that I can just tear the pieces as I'm working with them. There doesn't have to be anything precise about it. And I just take my time and cover my bird. And this is really reinforcing the structure that we made. So I finished the first layer here. There's paper all over the front and the back of this bird. Here's my extra glue, and I'm going to just cover that with plastic wrap. Wash the brush thoroughly, clean it, but I'll cover this with plastic wrap and see if I can use it again. I just take the bird and take the legs and stick it into a wax candle, and that way it stays upright. And I'll just let this dry for 24 to 48 hours, whatever's necessary. There's not a lot of layers. The next layer I'll come back and add some paper, but add mostly the tissue paper, and that will smooth out any edges. So I've let this dry overnight. It's been 24 hours and this is completely dry. Because I use the Mod Podge and water mixture, it dries fairly quickly, especially because this is only one coat of paper on top of the bird. Now you could stop here if you want. You could add a second coat of paper. I'm going to add a second coat, but I'm going to use tissue paper instead of book pages. So this is far thinner than the first layer. Again, I'm going to use my solution here, and this is just the Mod Podge and water. I'll remix it again. I wash my brush thoroughly before I set it down to dry for the night, and the Mod Podge will settle, so I just want to stir it. And I wouldn't keep this mixture for very long. This is only overnight. This is probably the extent of which I'll keep it, unless I'm working on a project that I know I'm going to work with daily for a few days. But this is nothing I would want to keep for weeks at a time or anything like that. Now, because the tissue paper is so fragile, I'm going to do this a little differently. Instead of painting the paper, which of course you can do, but I find it to be very fragile this way, I'm just going to paint onto my bird and then put the tissue paper on top of it and then paint over it. So I just painted a little bit on the bird, and then I just gently pat with the wet brush, and I don't let this brush dry. I like to keep it very wet because I want the tissue paper to really give and move around. So I can just press it down all around, getting out any wrinkles. If it's too thick with wrinkles, I'll remove it, or I can just put another piece of tissue over it just to build up those wrinkles. But I like to just add my glue mixture and then cover it again with just a wet brush, really covering the bird. And I'll continue all around the bird doing this technique. I like to work on one side at a time. And so for over here, on the areas that are going to be covered with the remainder of the tissue paper, I'll just wet the area on the side of the bird and then wait to flip it over. I can flip it all over when all these pieces are together. So I'll have a series of them on top of the bird and on the side here. And then all at once, I'll cover the backing. Again, I don't hesitate to tear down the paper to make it smaller, just like this. And I'll continue this all on the front and back of this bird. So there, I have this piece completely covered with the tissue paper from the pattern. So it has a little brown hue to it, a little cast of brown, which is totally fine. The next step, I'm going to gesso it, which is just like a primer, and then I can start painting them. Right now, though, I have to be patient, and that's my hardest part. I have my candle again, and I will stick my bird in the candle to dry, again, overnight, or as long as it takes for it to be thoroughly dry. I can't start the next part until this is completely dry. Now let me just show you a little variation. So I made not only this bird, but over a dozen other birds just like it. They're all slightly different. I made a cardboard stencil for the shape of one of my birds, figuring that would help me to make lots of the birds and the wings, but then I decided I didn't want the same bird the entire time, so I just made different shapes. These are all very whimsical birds. They're not really based on a particular bird until I wanted to make one as a flamingo. Now I used 1 yard long bamboo skewers for the legs. and I covered it with 3 layers of paper. I didn't use tissue paper. I just used lots of paper. I really needed to reinforce it and make it very strong and durable. It took a while to dry. I let it dry in between each of the layers, but I have this really cute flamingo now that I'm going to gesso and paint, and I'll take you along on this journey as well. So now the bird has dried thoroughly. It's completely dry on both sides. Now I want to take some gesso. This is just a primer. I like to do this because of any writing that's on the print of the paper that was used to paper mache it. It's just a sealer, a primer. So I paint a thin coat all over it on both sides, and I like to use a disposable brush. I'll either use this type of wire brush or I'll use a foam brush. But because the gesso is such a great primer, it really can dry thoroughly and destroy the brush. So that's why I like to use disposable brushes. I'm trying to get a smooth coat, but it doesn't have to be perfect. The key is just to seal the entire piece. Now, if you want a perfectly smooth edge, you might want to sand it down or even add a second coat to your tissue paper. But I don't need that. It's not required for this project. In fact, I prefer that little rustic look. So I'll paint all of this, and then I'll stick it back in my candle and let it dry before I start painting it. Now I gessoed all of my birds. Depending on how much gesso you use, the thickness of the layer will determine if anything shows through, any prints of the paper that you used. You can even go back and add a second layer of gesso. I like to add just 1 layer, and I make it thin because, again, it's okay if I get some newsprint showing through or some text, at least for this project. But if it was a project that I did not want to have that showing through, then I would definitely go back and do a second layer. And I just want to make sure I get into all the grooves here. So once that's all done and smooth, I'll stick it in my candle and let it dry. The gesso does not take very long to dry. This will probably be dry in less than an hour, but I'm going to give it overnight anyway. And so I'll let that sit just like that. So now my gesso has dried. And I took the sanding paper and I just lightly sanded it. The gesso has a little texture. It's a little bit gritty, like sand. So I just sanded a little bit to smooth it out. On something like this, when I have all this texture showing through, it's probably not even necessary. But I like to do that. If there's any edges like this, I'll come in there and just sand them off or clip them, just to smooth it out. So then I like to paint the birds, and if you'd like, I can show you a video on the exact process of painting those whimsical birds, but I always start off with a solid color. I like to use different colors for this technique because I'm doing this as a table centerpiece. I have about 4 or 5 colors that I use: a pink, a turquoise, green, yellow, and then I threw in a black and a white one. So I paint them solid, let them dry, and then I add the details, like the eyes. I'll add some patterns, just something whimsical. I want it to really look cute. So this is my first coat on the bird. I like to paint 2 coats, but I have to let this one dry thoroughly first. After that, I'll paint my detail work. And if you'd like a video on that, I can show you that in the future. But this is just my first coat. I'll add a second coat the exact same way. And now let me show you the finished birds.
So these are the birds all together on the table. One thing I didn't mention is how I prop them up on this little mount here. My husband actually printed that for me using his 3D printer. He printed 1 mount for each bird. He made little holes on the top so I can stick the bamboo skewers in, and it's slightly adjustable. So that's how I make my flock of birds. I can't wait to see them on the table and see my father's reaction for them. And if you've enjoyed this video and would like some access to behind-the-scenes footage, some posts on other things that I'm working on, some inspirational discussions, and access to a slow stitching library, please consider becoming a paid member of my channel. Thank you, and have a great day.